At the time, I thought we were just walking into another underground chamber. Cities are full of them. Old tunnels, abandoned utility rooms, forgotten infrastructure buried beneath newer construction. But the moment the lights hit the walls, I knew this place was different. The room wasn't empty. It was filled with machines. Rows of glass battery cylinders lined the walls, connected by thick copper wiring that ran across the stone like veins. Massive bundles of insulated cables disappeared into conduits carved directly into the floor. And in the center of the chamber stood a machine that looked like something halfway between an electrical generator and a computer. Rotating brass cylinders, rows of relay switches, control panels covered in metal dials and mechanical indicators. At first glance, it looked familiar, like early 20th century electrical equipment. But the longer I stared at it, the stranger it became. Because the machine wasn't just electrical. Large spiral horns surrounded the central apparatus, built from polished metal like giant acoustic amplifiers. Stone cavities carved into the walls formed resonance chambers. Copper rods connected those chambers directly into the machine's wiring system. Whoever built this machine hadn't just designed an electrical computer, they had built something far more advanced. A system that processed information using electricity, resonance, and sound frequencies at the same time. And as I would soon learn, this wasn't the only one. The chamber was enormous, roughly 40 feet across, with thick stone columns supporting the ceiling. Along the walls stood hundreds of glass battery cells mounted in heavy copper racks. Each one was filled with chemical solution and connected to the others through thick metal conductors. When I traced the wiring from the battery banks, they all led toward the machine in the center of the room. That machine looked almost like an early computer. Horizontal brass cylinders rotated slowly across a steel frame. Thousands of electrical contacts lined their surfaces, connected to relay switches mounted along nearby panels. The entire device was wired together through bundles of cables running beneath the floor. But surrounding the machine were structures I had never seen in any modern electrical system. Large curved metal horns extended from the machine's frame. Stone resonance chambers were built directly into the architecture of the room. Even the floor had hollow channels that seemed designed to carry vibration. It slowly dawned on me that the machine was designed to process two different types of signals simultaneously. Electrical signals moved through the wires. Resonant frequencies moved through the structure itself. This was not just a computer, it was a resonance-based computing machine. Once I started following the wiring, things became even more unbelievable. The cables running out of the chamber didn't simply connect to nearby equipment, they disappeared into underground tunnels. Large conduits built into the stone carried the cables deep beneath the city. When I followed one of those tunnels, it eventually opened into another chamber, and inside that chamber, I saw the same thing again. More battery arrays, more relay racks, another large machine with rotating electrical drums and resonance amplifiers, except this one was even larger. That's when I realized something. These rooms weren't isolated installations. They were connected. Each chamber functioned like a node. Signals entered one machine, traveled through underground wiring networks, and triggered processes inside another machine somewhere else beneath the city. What I was looking at wasn't just a buried machine, it was an entire computing network. The more I studied the machines, the clearer their purpose became. Electricity powered the system, but it wasn't the only force being used. Large circular plates mounted into the machines vibrated when electrical current passed through them. Those vibrations traveled through metal amplifiers attached to the structure. The amplifiers directed the sound into resonance chambers carved into the walls. From there, the vibrations moved through copper rods embedded in the architecture and into other parts of the machine. It was a system designed to amplify and control frequency. In modern terms, it looked like the machines were using sound waves as an additional processing medium. Electric signals moved through wires. Resonance signals moved through the building itself. The result was a computing system operating on two layers simultaneously. something far beyond the limitations of modern electronics. Some chambers were dedicated entirely to energy storage. When I walked into one of these rooms, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The entire hall was filled with batteries, thousands of glass cylinders mounted in rows from floor to ceiling. Copper cables connected them together into enormous electrical banks. But what fascinated me most was how the batteries were integrated into the computing system. Signals didn't simply pass through the machines directly. They were routed through different battery arrays first. Depending on which batteries were active, the electrical signal changed strength and timing before entering the resonance machines. In other words, the batteries weren't just power sources, they were part of the logic system. When engineers first began studying these underground machines, many of them realized they were looking at technology that didn't belong in the historical timeline. The system combined electrical switching, acoustic resonance, and large-scale energy storage in ways that modern engineering rarely attempts. Some inventors became obsessed with recreating parts of the system. They built relay computers, electrical oscillators, experimental machines designed to generate controlled resonance. One of the most famous engineers exploring these ideas was Nikola Tesla. Tesla believed electricity could travel through the air and the earth using resonance. He built machines designed to generate powerful electrical vibrations. When I compare Tesla's work to the machines I saw underground, the similarities are impossible to ignore. It feels less like Tesla invented something new and more like he was reconstructing something old. The more time I spent down there, the less it felt like we had discovered something forgotten. It felt like we had discovered something that wasn't supposed to be found, because once you really look at how that underground system worked, it doesn't just look advanced, it looks incompatible with everything that came after it. Up above, the world was being rebuilt around simple electrical grids, power stations feeding energy outward, wires stretched in straight lines, everything controlled, measured, and limited. But beneath the surface, this system didn't follow any of those rules. It didn't depend on a single source. It didn't rely on direct input and output. It moved energy through layers, through wires, through resonance, through the structure itself. It adjusted, balanced, reacted. It wasn't just infrastructure. It behaved like a network that could manage itself. And that's when it really started to bother me. Because a system like that doesn't just get replaced for being outdated. It gets replaced because it can't be controlled the same way. And once you realize that, everything else starts to look different. The sealed tunnels, the buried chambers, the way entire sections of the system were cut off instead of dismantled. It doesn't feel like something that was abandoned. It feels like something that was taken offline, deliberately, quietly, like whoever came after it understood exactly what it was and decided it wasn't something the new world was going to keep running. At first, no one had a name for what we were finding. Engineers described it in technical terms: electrical systems, relay networks, resonance chambers. But the deeper we went, the harder it became to explain it that way, because this wasn't just engineering. It was architecture, it was infrastructure, it was a complete system built into the foundation of entire cities, and eventually, a different term started showing up in conversations, quietly at first. Almost like people didn't want to say it too loudly. They started calling it old world technology. And then more specifically, they started calling it Tartarian. Not as a theory, not as a myth, but as a way to describe something that clearly didn't belong to the modern timeline. Something older, something buried, something that had been there long before the cities above it took their current form. And once you saw enough of it, it was hard to call it anything else. Most people think of underground discoveries as small, a room here, a tunnel there. That's not what this was. The deeper I went, the larger the chambers became. Some of them weren't rooms at all. They were massive halls, entire underground facilities built from stone and metal, filled with machinery that stretched farther than the light could reach. In one of these chambers, I remember seeing something that changed how I understood the entire system. A central structure, easily the size of a small building, surrounded by layers of relay racks, battery towers, and resonance amplifiers. Wires ran into it from every direction, thick bundles feeding into its core. The structure itself wasn't just processing signals, it was coordinating them, like a central processor in a modern network. But instead of microchips and code, it used rotating electrical drums, synchronized relay systems, and harmonic resonance to organize the flow of information. It felt like I was standing inside a server, not metaphorically, literally. There's something I don't think I'll ever forget. It wasn't just what I saw, it was what I heard. Even without power fully running through the system, some parts of the machinery still reacted when we interacted with it. A low hum, a vibration through the floor, metal components resonating at specific tones when current passed through certain circuits. It wasn't random, it was controlled, deliberate. The machines didn't just process information silently, they sang. Different sections of the system produced different frequencies, almost like each part of the network was tuned to a specific range, and when those frequencies overlapped, you could feel it in the air. It made me realize something I hadn't fully understood before. This system wasn't just electrical, it was acoustic, a computer that used sound as part of its processing language. The more we documented the machinery, the harder it became to explain how it was built. Some components were massive, solid metal structures that would have required equipment we still struggle to use today. Others were incredibly precise. Fine electrical contacts, perfectly spaced, repeated thousands of times across rotating drums and relay arrays. And then there were the materials. Copper everywhere, glass battery cells that were still intact, insulated wiring that had somehow survived underground conditions for decades, maybe longer. Nothing about it felt experimental. It felt finished. Like we weren't looking at early versions of something. We were looking at a system that had already been perfected. At some point, I stopped asking how it was built and started asking something else. Why was it buried? Because this wasn't a collapse. It wasn't random destruction. The system hadn't been torn apart. It had been sealed, tunnels closed, entrances blocked, layers of earth and construction placed over it, almost like someone had intentionally removed it from use without destroying it completely. And that raised a bigger question. If this system was still functional at some point, what replaced it? But the more I thought about it, the more unsettling that question became. Because if this had been a failure, if it had stopped working on its own, there would be signs of that. Damage, decay, breakdown. But that's not what I saw. What I saw looked intact, preserved, like something that had been shut down properly. And that suggests something very different. It suggests there was a moment where this entire system was still active, still running, still connected beneath the city, and at some point someone made the decision to turn it off, not piece by piece, but all at once. A full system shut down. And once that happened, the next step wasn't removal, it was concealment. Because burying something like this doesn't just hide it physically, it removes it from memory, from understanding, from possibility. And that might be the most important part. Not that it was hidden, but that it was made to be forgotten. Above ground, everything moved in a different direction. Simpler electrical systems, centralized power, straightforward infrastructure, nothing like the layered, interconnected network beneath the surface. It was as if the world had shifted from a complex, decentralized system to a controlled, simplified one. And once you've seen both, it's hard not to notice the difference. What I saw underground didn't feel like an early version of what we have today. It felt like something far beyond it. Not just more advanced, but more refined, more efficient in a way that's hard to explain unless you've stood in front of it yourself. There was no excess, no wasted motion. Every wire, every relay, every resonance chamber felt like it had a purpose that connected perfectly with everything around it. The system didn't fight against itself. It flowed. Energy moved cleanly through it. Signals didn't feel forced. They felt guided, like the entire network had been designed with a level of precision that made modern systems look rough by comparison. And once you've seen something like that, you can't help but think about what it would be like if it was still active. A world where energy isn't constantly strained or rerouted, where systems don't overload or collapse under pressure, where infrastructure doesn't need constant expansion just to keep up. A world where the foundation itself is already optimized, already balanced, already complete. And that's the part that stays with you, because it doesn't feel like we improved on that system. It feels like we stepped away from it, simplified it, rebuilt something easier to manage, but nowhere near as elegant. And once that thought sets in, it's hard to shake, because it makes you wonder if what we have now isn't the peak of technology, but a shadow of something much greater that came before it. I'll never forget that day. The moment we stepped into that chamber and the lights hit the walls, rows of glass batteries lining the stone, wires running through the structure like they had always been part of it, and those machines sitting there in silence, not broken, not destroyed, just still. At the time, I thought we had discovered something old, something forgotten, but the more I've thought about it since, the more it feels like something else entirely. It didn't feel lost, it felt left behind. Like whatever that system was, it didn't fade out over time, it didn't collapse, it didn't fail. It was stopped and then buried, because nothing about it looked unfinished, nothing about it looked experimental. Everything felt precise, intentional, like it had already reached a point where there was nothing left to improve. And I remember hearing something else down there too, not from the machines but from the people who had seen pieces of it before. Quiet conversations, things said under their breath, a word that kept coming up, Tartaria. At the time, it sounded like just another name, another label people used when they didn't have a better explanation. But the more I saw, the more it started to feel like they weren't guessing, they were remembering something. But those conversations didn't last. They faded, got quieter, then disappeared completely. And looking back now, it's hard not to notice how quickly everything around these discoveries seemed to be sealed off. Tunnels closed, entrances filled, access restricted, not in a chaotic way, but in a controlled one. Like decisions were being made somewhere above it all, decisions that didn't come from confusion, but from understanding. Because burying something like that isn't just about covering it up physically, it's about removing it from thought, from discussion, from possibility. And that's what it feels like happened, not just to the system, but to the memory of it. Because if what I saw was real, if that network really did exist beneath entire cities, then it means there was a time when the world operated on something completely different, something more efficient, more balanced, more complete. And we don't have that anymore. What we have now works, it powers things, it connects things, but it doesn't feel like what I saw down there. It doesn't feel like it was built with the same level of understanding or the same kind of intention. What I saw didn't feel like the beginning of technology. It felt like the end of it, a system that had already been refined to a level we don't even attempt to reach. And now it's gone. Or maybe not gone, just out of reach. Because those chambers are still down there, sealed behind layers of concrete and earth. The tunnels still exist, the wiring, the machines, pieces of something that once ran beneath everything. And sometimes, I can't help but think about what that world must have been like. A world where systems didn't strain, where energy moved the way it was meant to, where everything felt aligned.
And then I think about how easily something like that could disappear if the right people decided it should. That's the part that stays with me, because it doesn't feel like we simply lost something. It feels like something was quietly taken out of our hands and made to disappear so completely that most people would never even know it existed in the first place. And whatever that system truly was, whatever it was capable of, it's hard to shake the feeling that we weren't supposed to find it again.